Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
I got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. Oh, no.
Amateur Traveler, episode 406. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about dachas and volcanoes and a really, really, really long train ride as we go to the Russian Far East.
Got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. We're going to dispense with the usual news stories today because the show is long enough and because I don't have a lot of voice, and so I won't make you listen to this voice. Before we get into this week's interview, I do have a sponsorship for you for the Amateur Traveler. I'm working with a partner right now that has identified a number of credit cards that are particularly useful for travelers, and so I have just changed credit cards to get some better deals, especially because there are two different types of cards that you should look at. One is cards that don't have a foreign transaction fee, and the other is cards in the U.S. are just starting to add the chip and PIN system that is quite common and very useful to have when you go to Europe. So if you are good with credit and it's a good time for you to look at changing credit cards, go to amateurtraveler.com/credit card to see some offers that I think you might be interested in. I'd like to welcome back to the show Robert Reid, who's come to talk to us about the Russian Far East. Robert, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me. Nothing better than the Russian Far East, so happy to talk about it.
And I'm glad to hear that because this is a show that we are actually recording on Groundhog Day, and unfortunately for Robert, this may seem a little bit like a Groundhog Day episode because he and I actually already did this show, and there was a problem with the recording, so I appreciate your patience in doing this again, but it was really great the first time, so I'm sure it will be wonderful. Robert has been on the show before talking about his home state of Oklahoma in, I think, the most literary episode we've ever done on the Amateur Traveler, so check that out. And Robert, you are now a freelance journalist. Last time you came to us, you were the Lonely Planet editor for the USA.
That's right. Last year, I left Lonely Planet. I also left New York. I live in Oregon, and I'm writing regularly for National Geographic Traveler, as well as a new column for transitions abroad and doing freelance world and a little bit of consulting. So it's the big crazy world of freelancing. That's after like 15 years at Lonely Planet.
And we'll talk about that a little more at the end. But first, we've got people starting to look at Russia here for the Sochi Olympics, which is coming up. But we're going a little further east than the Olympics are. Tell us about where you're taking us mentally here in this particular episode.
Russia is big. It's a very big place, and I've spent a good chunk of my life there. I studied Russian in college and lived in Moscow and Petersburg the first summer of Russia in 91. This is on the other end of Russia. You're talking about going 7 time zones east of Moscow to the part that's really the Siberia of Siberia. In Russian, that's Dalny Vostok, which is the Russian Far East. And we're talking about an area about the size of the lower 48 that's east of Lake Baikal, which is kind of a famous natural attraction in Russia, curving over the border of China, actually extending as far east as almost to the face of Alaska up at the Kamchatka Peninsula, down to Vladivostok, which is just a little bit east of most of North Korea. Nagasaki, Japan is. You're talking very far east in Russia.
And, I don't think I asked you this before, but what led to the interest in Russia in the first place? I mean, growing up on the plains of Oklahoma, you're pretty far from Russia culturally as well as physically. So why study Russian and why the love affair with Russia even before you went there?
I was a kid of the 70s and 80s, and Russia was a place that was really seen as something to fear. I mean, during the Cold War, for better or worse. I mean, this is before Sting made that ridiculous song, Russians. He sang, "I hope your Russians love their children too," which of course they love their children too. And I just was really interested in the other, I think. I was interested in something that seemed forbidden, and I read Russian literature. I started studying Russian. I found it very alluring, the Cyrillic alphabet and the limited things that I knew about Russia. And that eventually led to visiting there. And when I started working for Lonely Planet, it was very high on my list to do something connected to the Trans-Siberian. I worked on that guidebook twice and signed on for the Russian Far East, way, way, way out there.
And why should someone grab a dog-eared copy of the Lonely Planet Guide to the Russian Far East and head to that part of the world?
I think that the Russian Far East is, in a way, it's like it's like the dot of the exclamation point. It's like the ultimate adventure and that just little bonus. A handful of your listeners, perhaps, are going to do a once-in-a-lifetime trip and do the Trans-Siberian. And of those, only a trickle of the people that do that actually make it to the Far East, even though that's where the Trans-Siberian ends, going from 9,300 kilometers from Moscow to Vladivostok, because most people will go for several days. They'll go to Irkutsk, about 2/3 across Russia in the heart of Siberia, go to Lake Baikal, giant, massive lake that dwarfs the Great Lakes, surrounded by mountains, all kinds of weird animals that live in it, just very clear and beautiful and amazing. And then they'll cut down to Mongolia and China. Logical itinerary. It's very logical. But if you take the Trans-Siberian all the way across and keep going east of Baikal into towns that were built specifically to justify a railroad out there, essentially, during the Tsarist era and also in the Soviet era, you have these towns that were just kind of created to look a little bit like European towns, like little Petersburgs of the East, but you're talking about 6, 7 time zones east of Moscow. It's the dot of the exclamation point. It's Russia at its edge. I like to think of the USA-Russia relationship, going back to your previous question, is in a way, those two countries are the most similar on Earth in a way, I find, because the United States is kind of an ideological country. It's a new country. It has an intentional capital that was built from scratch for that purpose, as is Russia. Both are transcontinental countries. Peter the Great created Petersburg to be in the fashion of a Venice and trying to remake Europe in Russia. And as these countries were kind of developing in that era, they eyed the West or the East in the Russian case. And so our wild West and manifest destiny and going and exploring and really settling and conquering the lands of the West for better and worse in American history is very similar to how Russia developed and eyed Siberia. Vladivostok, the end of the line, means in Russian to rule the East. And they are kind of peering over the Sea of Japan and looking at China. And that was really how they kind of fashioned their whole country and how it developed over the last 200 years. So you don't have to be a history nut to appreciate that, but it's for a completist, following the Trans-Siberian to the very end and seeing what happens. You're right above China. There are times you can get off in a town like Blagoveshchensk, and you look across the river and you see China. And if you have binoculars, as I did, you could see little Chinese kids over there swimming on the shore. And then you look around and there's Lenin statues and European architecture in the same birch trees that you might see in Petersburg. You feel like you're in Europe. It's weird. And so I just find that it almost is a waste to take that Trans-Siberian and then cut out before you reach its end. So the reason to go is to complete that exclamation point, I think, and see Russia to its very end.
Now, when we say the Trans-Siberian, I think you have told me before that if I didn't stop, if I just went as fast as I could, it's still going to take me a week.
Yeah, 7 days. Moscow to Vladivostok, which is the official Trans-Siberian, takes 7 days. Now, the worst thing you could possibly do is to do it in 7 days without stopping. I mean, first of all, there's no showers. You want to get out and take a shower, and you want the other people on the train to occasionally get out and take a shower if you can help it. And also, you're in the middle of Siberia. You're in Novosibirsk and towns like Krasnoyarsk and Yekaterinburg, where the last Tsar was killed with his family and during the Russian Revolution. You get to Lake Baikal, then into the Far East. You want to stop a few times. If someone's planning like a 2-week trip to Russia, that would work perfectly for that kind of thing. You have 7 days of travel. You don't have to stop for long because it doesn't always. Russia is a difficult country, and sometimes it doesn't reward you to be in Novosibirsk for a week. It's not going to be the same thing as setting up in Lisbon or Miami for a week, but it does reward you for a day or two. Like you were out in the middle of this place in Siberia or Far East Russia, and then move on. So I do think it works really well, kind of in a 2-week itinerary crossing Russia.
Well, and I want to talk to you about an itinerary that you would recommend, but before we do that, you're clearly a Russophile. I don't know how to say that, but
trying to. I'm trying to understand how to say it too. I don't know what it is. Russophile, I guess.
But you say that Russia is difficult.
I covered some strange destinations for Lonely Planet and other writing projects I've been on. I worked in Burma when there was a tourism boycott. I had to be very under the radar. It was difficult researching places and things like that. I worked in Transylvania, in Bulgaria. I worked in Colombia when it was still really people were a little frightened to go there. Some tricky destinations, I may say. Russia is several notches of difficulty past any of these kind of things. It's, for one, I think that everyone should learn Cyrillic. You don't have to necessarily know Russian. It's a hard language to learn. But Cyrillic only takes a couple days. Then you can read your tickets, you can read the street signs, you can read the town that you're in and things like that. And Russians will love it if you can read some of that, and they'll help you with that, and you'll really bond with people. It's also difficult because there's lines. Prepare to wait. I mean, it's not like the end of the Soviet Union meant that waiting stopped. I mean, Russia is a place that, with extreme patience that I find tested sometimes, waiting in line to buy a ticket for my next train journey. So there is a certain amount of patience that's required in terms of waiting and planning. It's difficult to get information. It's not like just showing up in Zurich, going to a tourist information and finding out places to stay or train times and things like that with ease. It's not like that in Russia at all.
Okay. And how would you recommend we tackle the Russian Far East? What kind of itinerary would you suggest?
Anyone that's going on the Far East is most likely going to head to the end of the line of Vladivostok, and Vladivostok is one of the highlight cities. It's kind of, in a way, like a little San Francisco of Russia. It's a very hilly place with funicular trams that go up to the top of hills, and you look out over a snaking bay that's called the Golden Horn because it's so alike the Golden Horn in Istanbul. And up close in some of the neighborhoods, it can get a little grimy, and there's can be kind of 60s and 70s housing blocks that you see in a lot of Russian towns. It can be a little gray and things like that. But there are enough buildings from the era that was booming during the Tsar era, very European style. Yul Brynner, by the way, was born in Vladivostok to Swiss parents, and his house is still there. So Vladivostok is the place you go. But otherwise, it's almost kind of picking and choosing things. If you're going by train, there's two options. A lot of people don't realize, but about 2/3 away going east across Russia, there's another line that goes to the north of the Trans-Siberian, which is a very kind of rattly little pokey train that's called the BAM, which is the Baikal-Amur main line. This was only finished in the 80s, and it was a big Soviet project that they had Komsomol, which are young communist leagues that were going out as heroes to develop this train line, which really is very, very much one of the great achievements in engineering anywhere in the world, because you're going through areas of permafrost, you're cutting through dozens of mountains to build tunnels, and permafrost itself means that the earth is moving. It thaws and freezes, so that wreaks havoc on any kind of development, much less trains or towns that would build up on it. That's an interesting line that goes just a little bit north of the Trans-Siberian. I mean, if you look at Russia, it's like think of Canada, and it's going up to Arctic Circle, and most of it is developed towards the south.
Right.
And that's where the Trans-Siberian snakes along the China border out there. And the band line goes just a little bit. On a map, it's like an inch, but it's quite a bit further than an inch in real space. But it goes east-west up there. And I've had some really interesting experiences going on there and then taking a little splinter line back down to the Trans-Siberian. So if you look at the highlights, you look at Vladivostok. One day west of Vladivostok is Khabarovsk, which is a big town that's in some ways the most attractive town in all of the Far East. It's near the China border. It's on the Amur River. That might be a place. Up on the BAM line, the nicest town is Komsomolsk, which is named for the Komsomol, which was that young communist league. Those are probably the top 3 towns that you might go to by train. Then you have all kinds of adventures that you can get way up there. You look at Yakutsk, which is the coldest city on Earth. It's a city on stilts because it's on permafrost. You have a permafrost institute. You have a big Yakut population, or Sakha. It's an ethnic minority there. Yet Lenin statues. It looks like Europe on stilts. Or Kamchatka, which is dangling next to Alaska, which is just solid volcanoes. And you can go and visit all kinds of volcanoes. That's like the most often touristed place of the Far East. I'm giving you a long answer because it is it is a very difficult place you can't see all of that on a reasonable trip. I spend months there when I'm doing this.
Let's slow down then, and let's do those 3 cities that you mentioned on the railroad and then the Kamchatka Peninsula in a little more detail. So you mentioned the end of the rail line, and I'm drawing a blank, Yelbrunner City. Vladivostok.
Fun to say.
Yeah. So what should we do in Vladivostok?
You take a picture right there at the train station. It has the 9288 kilometer mark that marks the end of the Trans-Siberian. And you walk around the bay. It's a naval port too, so you can go on this World War II submarine and things like that. Take the funicular up to the top of the mountain. You get a view of it. There's an interesting little island across of Vladivostok called Ruski Island. And this is an island that always feels like it's on the verge, locals tell me, of becoming like a big beach destination, or that it's going to transform and have spas and things. And right now it's very klutzily leaving the days of the Soviet Union, but there's a ferry that you can take for very cheap over from Vladivostok and kind of go. And I actually went with a local that I met and got off right before the main stop on this different part of the island because they knew of a family that's living off the grid there in an old Tsar era, because they got tired of their jobs in Vladivostok. So they just took over the bunker. And it is the most bizarre experience I've had of going to meet these people that set up all these different gardens of local kind of produce. They've made some apple cake that I had. You go into the bunker, and this is like 20 feet thick concrete, can withstand bomb after bomb. And they're living in this dark kind of damp space year-round. Weird. And then they showed me these private beaches out there and things like that. So I had all kinds of funny little experiences that are kind of, to be honest, out of the guidebooks. They're kind of the things that you pick up when you're there, and it happens a lot. People in the Far East say, in Moscow, Petersburg, people are really interested in literature. They want to sit down and have conversations about literature and science and philosophy. Here, we just like to be outside. They don't care if it's cold or if it's hot in summer. And just going out to Ruski Island, people love to take walks and show you things. And I had that kind of experience everywhere I went Far East. So Vladivostok is, because it's on the water, it's on the ocean, you have these kind of beaches and islands that you can go to. It's a different kind of Russian experience than you would have anywhere else in Siberia, really.
And you mentioned no matter whether it's cold or hot. I know when we did this first time, I would have assumed that since we were going to Siberia, we'd go in the summer.
Mm-hmm. The funny thing is that, first of all, when you look at Russia, it's mostly been developed to the south, like in Canada. Mm-hmm. You have towns clinging near the U.S. border because of climate considerations. It's very similar in Russia when you cross too, but there's a difference. Russia gets colder as you go east. Not just as you go north, but also as you go east. So a town like Khabarovsk, as I mentioned earlier, is like equivalent to like Yellowknife in Canada. It's like a town of 400,000, but it's like dealing with winters that are extremely cold. So if you go in winter, you're going to breathe in your nostrils. It's going to feel like some kind of gas coming in of ice, and you're just going to freeze as soon as you go outside. That said, people don't realize how hot Siberian summers are. Very hot, 90, 95 degrees. I was in Yakutsk, which is the town that you can get to maybe by river ferry, maybe by a van on weird roads, dirt roads, like a 40-hour ride from the BAM line. I tried it and it failed. Or you fly in for a lot of money, $600-700 from Khabarovsk up to
But you
Yakutsk.
tried and you failed to get
I
there.
tried and I failed. My driver couldn't quite figure it out, and after 4 or 5 hours of kind of circling around a town, this coal mining town, as high up as you can get any splinter of a train line towards Yakutsk, still a 40-hour drive, and eventually he gave up, so I gave up, and I ended up flying.
Huh.
So I had my greatest, I've traveled a lot doing guidebooks and writing articles and things like that, and the biggest sick ailment that I've ever got was from heat exhaustion, dehydration, or just exposure in the coldest city in the world, Yakutsk. Yakutsk is like minus 25 in winter, minus 40 in winter, really, really cold. It's about 250,000 people there. And in summer, it's 95 degrees, and I was out of commission for 3 days, just in a hotel clinging to an AC because I was so just feeling heat just coming out on my body unlike anything. I was just completely out of it because I was just had just constant exposure to the sun because it's white nights there in June when I was there, and I never got away from the sun. And so how that will relate to anyone going into Siberia is that if you go in summer, even on the trains, those air conditioners you think you aren't going to need in Siberia, but in the summer you do, but they click off when you stop, which is frequently. And you get very hot on the train. Some of the train windows don't open. You can really get really stuffy on those trains. I think that it's much better to go in May or June or maybe early September. I'm not as shy of going in fall or something like that, but I think the peak of summer is the busiest time and also really uncomfortable. Who would have thought?
And then you mentioned when we were back in Vladivostok, the funicular. So Vladivostok is a hilly city.
Very hilly, very hilly. It's like a little San Francisco out there. And you see a lot of mountains and hills as you go. I mean, a lot of people think of the Trans-Siberian, oh, you're going to be glued to the window the whole time. But really, it isn't so much about the scenery. Vladivostok is a pretty place. Like Baikal is really beautiful. There's some nice views in a place like Khabarovsk. But often you go in between cities. Khabarovsk, I know these are kind of towns that don't roll off the tongue for many people, but that's 40 hours by train. 40 hours. You're on a train a really long time. You pass some mountains, you pass some fields with birch trees or taiga forest out there, and it doesn't look a whole lot different than what you saw 3 days before. A lot of Siberia is flat, a lot of Russia is flat. And so the real joy of it, and I think the real joy in particular when you think about this kind of trip, is about the train. And it isn't so much what is out the window, but what's in it. Because Russians are misunderstood often. Because a lot of times your first impression of Russians in Russia, even for fellow Russians, is that they can be cold and people are not the most polite if you go in and ask for something at a post office or trying to make a call or stop someone on the street for help. Sometimes it's not as warm of a reaction as you get in some parts of the world. But that doesn't mean that the Russians aren't friendly. They actually can shame you with their hospitality. Once you get out of the public sector into private, they would treat you like a cousin. But that also works on the train. Because if you're on a train, whether you're on the cheap Platzkartny compartment, which is like an open compartment with like tons of bunks, or where I usually went on was the coupe, which was 4 bunks and one little cabin. And so you would have like a rotating cast of characters that come in. I might be on for 60 hours. Someone will come in for 15 or 20 hours. And by the time they leave, I'm full with their vegetables from their gardens and maybe their vodka. They often will bring it on, and just all kinds of emails and addresses and photos taken. And you are the new cousin of this family. People are very nice, and that was my best way, really, of meeting Russians. Was just being on the train and seeing who comes a knocking on your door to stay with you for about 20 hours or so, depending on how far you're going.
The other thing you mentioned is somebody living in a bunker in Vladivostok, and that obviously is talking about how the country has changed too, obviously just in your lifetime and mine. What changes have you seen over the last, say, decade?
Some of these places, the first things that you'll see, I was in Russia right after the Soviet Union fell. I was not in Siberia. But I have that image of what Petersburg and Moscow were like then. And you go to places like Vladivostok or Khabarovsk or Petropavlovsk or to a degree Yakutsk, a city on stilts on permafrost, you'll see a few new buildings, a new theater that's been built. The first changes you tend to see are restaurants. And you see like these kind of traditional Russian restaurants, which will be a place that you'll probably eat at a lot, which is very kind of like 19th century kind of dacha, kind of traditional woodsy design with like kind of folk style, like clothing on the wall on display. You also see a lot of Chinese restaurants, often from Chinese people many Chinese immigrants are going into Russia to work. And you see this explosion of Chinese restaurants. Sometimes you'll see Italian restaurants and things. So I think the first changes in a way is that you'll see billboards and things that you wouldn't have seen 20 years ago. But that said, there's a lot. And what I think is fascinating about it, what makes it unlike a lot of places, is how much hasn't changed. I mean, I went to Sakhalin Island, which is off the east coast. It's like a little northeast of Vladivostok, so north of Japan. It almost looks like an extension of Japan, of these islands. And this is home to a lot of oil reserves, a lot of oil money coming in out of Sakhalin Island. And if you go up, it's a very narrow little island. If you go up, it's an overnight train from the south end of the island where you fly into Borovsk. It's an overnight train ride up there. And I went there because Anton Chekhov, the playwright in the late 1800s, actually went there as the first kind of gulag tourist, you could say, in 1890. And he was at the height of his literary powers in Moscow, and he crossed Russia in 3 months by ferries and horse carriages. This is right before the Trans-Siberian was built. And he went to this town of Alexandrovsk to see the Tsar-era penal colony. And this is actually Chekhov, his experiences there was his only nonfiction book, which is called Sakhalin Island. And this was like the prelogue to the gulags, I guess. And not a pleasant history, not a particularly pleasant present, I learned. And what I bring this up is Alexandrovsk doesn't look a lot different, just a more dilapidated than it did during the Brezhnev era. I mean, you see kind of factories and kind of rotting carcasses of ships that have been just left when it used to be a port. You see these housing blocks with 10 feet weeds all around them and chipped mosaics of Soviet heroes outside. I did see one little factory, and it had freshly painted lettering on it on the outside that said USSR, SSSP, SSSR 1939 in fresh paint. But the Lenin statue is still there. It hasn't changed. I mean, there's nothing really that's been added except maybe a little grocery with like a Coca-Cola sign on it. It doesn't look any different. And what you see out in Siberia and in the Russian Far East is that during the Soviet times, these were places where the economy, because they believed that the natural resources was going to cause a boom, an economic boom out there.
Right.
But they lived off subsidies. And after the end of the Soviet Union, the subsidies really trickled down or stopped. And so these places are just frozen moments of a weird time in history, talking about the Soviet Union, really. And for better or worse, they're still there. Populations are going down, et cetera. They're struggling. And that's fascinating. There is a lot that hasn't changed. You see the Lenin statues. You see the Soviet mosaics there. You see Lenin and Mark Street, the street signs and things like that. And there hasn't been that much changed. That can be depressing. Chekhov didn't have a great time at Alexandrovsk. I didn't really either. But it's that dot of exclamation point. It was fascinating to see that. Not for everyone, but I'm glad I went. I don't think I'll be back to Alexandrovsk, though, probably.
And then you mentioned the restaurants as one of the things that changed. The other thing you mentioned last time we talked was North Korean restaurants. Yeah.
There's a lot of North Koreans that went to various areas of the USSR. Some would call it as slave labor. I've seen it written as such, that were basically came in to work on the BAM train line that I was talking about, or developing some towns or mines, etc. Probably the biggest and most accessible North Korean population you can see is in Vladivostok, which is very near the North Korea border. In fact, a lot of Russians go into North Korea on day trips for the beaches, which I think is kind of hilarious. Beaches in North Korea. Americans can't do that, needless to say. But there's North Korean restaurants in Vladivostok, and I went to one that had, you go in, it's called Pyongyang, slightly outskirt neighborhood of Vladivostok. I got there by tram, very easy to get to. And there's two rooms, equal size, right next to each other. And one room is for the North Koreans, and one room is for the foreigners, including Russians and me. And so you're sitting in this other room and kind of trying to peek in to see if you can see the heads of North Koreans dining on bibimbap or whatever it was. And it was quite good Korean food, but I thought that was fascinating. Wow, I'm in this North Korean restaurant. I've never been to North Korea, and it felt like almost, to some degree, a proxy glimpse of what North Korea might be like.
Excellent. And then you mentioned Russian restaurants, and when I'm in my Russian restaurant, I'm going to order what?
Russian food can be expensive. Restaurants can be expensive in Russia. And if you have trying to hold on to a budget, don't be ashamed of going to a restaurant, ordering black bread, chorny chleb, which is very good in Russia, and soup. They have wonderful soups. I do believe that some hipster, this is an idea. One of your listeners should take this, and I want $30 or some free soup if they do it. And a streetcar vendor in San Francisco or New York or wherever of just Russian soups, because Russian soups are actually really underrated cuisine, I think. Shi is a soup you have all over Russia. It's like a cabbage soup with beef and potato, typical thing. You have a lot of fish soups in the Russian Far East, some of it around Baikal with amul, which is the white fish that they serve. People will be selling in foil, like smoked amul, on the train platform. So if you stop in some random town, you'll see this line of people begging you to get off and buy their smoked fish and things like that, which is always a good thing to do. But the soups are really good. You see a lot of like dumplings on the menu. You see chickens covered in various sauces and things like that. I never knew how to read the menu too well. My Russian's limited, so I was a little pick and point in some places. But I found that trying to save a little money, fill yourself up with good food, I went a long ways with those lunches of bread, soup, and go, rather than getting 3 courses and spending $40 or $50 or something like that.
Excellent. Now, if I'm in India and I walk into a restaurant, I'm going to smell curry. If I'm in Russia and I walk into a restaurant, I'm going to smell...
I think it's all dill. I mean, everything is coated in dill in Russia. I love that about Russia. It's like boiled cucumbers, everything's... It's like the first time I ever was exposed to dill. I grew up in Oklahoma. We don't know what dill is. So in 91 when I was there, I was like, what is this? I smell this in the air. It's just a hint of green on everything. Even ice cream, I think. Yeah, they should do that. I don't think they do. But dill and cucumber.
Excellent. Now, you mentioned 3 cities along the train routes. The second of the 3 cities would be?
Well, I'm going to talk about Komsomolsk. Komsomolsk, again, the Trans-Siberian line runs along the south border of Russia. And a little bit of a splinter line that crosses all of the Far East is the BAM line. And the best stop on the BAM, and you can do it north of Khabarovsk, which is a major stop on the Trans-Siberian. But up on the BAM line is Komsomolsk. This was created during the Soviet Union by young communist workers that went out to create the city from dust and basically justify the existence of this train line, BAM, which is still losing incredible amount of money. In fact, Gorbachev, when it was finished in the 80s, blamed stagnation, which eventually led to glasnost and kind of the demise of the Soviet Union, on the building of BAM. But Komsomolsk is kind of one of the most attractive towns on it, and it looks like a little Petersburg with pastel and salmon and sky blue colored buildings that look faintly European. You're on the Amur River, this big wide river that has beaches, interesting art museums and mosaics, and you can stay at this so-called Khrushchev's dacha, and this is a housing complex that the leader, Nikita Khrushchev, stayed at when he was premier. And I stayed there once, and you can just imagine the little security guards shaking the kopecks in their pockets as the great one was up the stairs watching the one channel on television, whatever it is. Real just time warp back into the 60s. So you go there, you can take these gulag tours. There's a lot of like old Soviet factories that are just sitting there. And I had some real fun experiences there, seeing broken, dismantled gulags near town, actually, and like failed tunnels that were built by gulag laborers. So there's that side of thing that's not always easy to access in parts of Russia. And pretty town. It was fun. Komsomolsk.
And you mentioned dacha, and that's the second time we've talked about it without really defining what that term is. So could you paint a picture of what you're talking about for people?
Dacha is the Russian dream. It's like people have their little boxy apartment in an urban-like place, and no matter where their home is, a little town in Siberia or in Moscow, they're kind of towns are built like little Hong Kong neighborhoods, very tight, small apartments all crammed together, despite the fact of how much space is around them. So a lot of people long for this dacha, which is a little country cabin, essentially, that's got a little plot of land around it, a little garden, and it's their pride and joy. You go stay in the dacha in the backyard. You have a little banya, or kind of a hot sauna, that they go out and strip down and throw water on the hot rocks and beat each other with birch leaves. I've had that experience.
And it sounded good right up until they beat each other with birch leaves part.
Yeah. When the giant man is Breeze too. You take them down, and it starts beating you with. You're completely nude in front of this Russian guy with birch leaves beating you. is this good? Should I be doing this? And they love, that's the thing. They're treating you like this kind of little lost nephew that, of course, they want to show you their dacha and have some of the frozen cherries that they saved from last season because you're there at the wrong time of year and you crunch these cherries like ice, or they have fresh cucumbers or tomatoes you eat like apples, and then you go out to the banya and just boil. I was scared. I've never felt that kind of heat before, or birch leaves crashing against my naked body before, but it's classic Russian experience and fun, ultimately.
Excellent. Anything more about that city before we move on to our third city on the railway?
No, I think that's Komsomolsk is a place a lot of people don't know about, and if you do make it on the BAM line, and very, very few do, it's worth making it to Komsomolsk. There's a good travel agent there that can help you arrange tours of like things I was talking about, the gulags and Soviet factories and things. Fascinating. Really interesting place.
Do you happen to know the name of the travel agent or how we could find?
Nata Tours, Nata. The guy's name is Mikhail, and I met him both times that I was there. I'm sure that he has the same mustache. The last time, the website was Komsomolsk. Nata.ru. That's KOMSOMOLSKNATA.ru, as in Russia.
Excellent. And our third city was?
Well, I mean, if you're going to stick on the railroad, you're going on the Trans-Siberian, going towards Vladivostok, an interesting place to stop is Birobidzhan, and that is about a day shy of Vladivostok. It's outside of the town Khabarovsk that I've mentioned a couple times, and this is in something called the Jewish Autonomous Zone.
Never had heard of that before.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I hadn't until I started researching this and going there, and it was a town that was developed when Stalin suggested it with a fist on the table, I think, of having Jewish Russians go migrate 6 time zones east of Moscow to this beautiful promised land, which of course ended up being a swamp. This is, I think, the late 30s, early 40s, perhaps. There was a wave of migration from Eastern European Russia there. And after many of the people that went there saw what was there, they left, and many of them ended up in Israel. There is still an active Jewish population there. There's a synagogue, there's a museum that talks a little bit about the history. And you walk out of the train station and there is a sculpture of a menorah. I mean, this is not your average Russian city. And it's a nice little place with kind of Tsar-era European leafy streets. It's all very walkable from the train station. You could stop off in Birobidzhan. You could dump your stuff off a lot of train stations have this. There's a dom otticha there, which means guest house. And it's a little kind of nice little dorm hotel or guest house in the train station itself, which is convenient for short stops. One, because it's inexpensive. It's perfectly clean. It's kind of a window to the past because it's a lot of kind of rusts and brown color schemes that were popular in 1971, I think. But you can stay there, leave your bags there, and then go in, see the town for a little bit, and head off. Birobidzhan is actually really manageable because it isn't too big, and it's just like one of those stories that really justifies getting off that train in Russia, because you see these intentional towns that were built under weird circumstances like that, and it's just like something you just can't see anywhere else. It's like your reaction is what my reaction was. What? There's a Jewish autonomous zone, 6 time zones east of Moscow and like just north of China? What? What is this? Yeah, went to the synagogue and I saw a bit of a service there. I got a copy of the newspaper. They have a little newspaper. And what a fascinating experience. Again, not for everyone. I mean, this isn't Tuscany, but it does reward people that are willing to explore that far end of Russia.
Excellent. And then you had mentioned 2 other places, and the first of which let's talk about would be Kamchatka. Kamchatka
is really probably the biggest destination of the far east of Russia, and it's very far removed of everything we talked about. I mean, you're talking about a vast area of marshes and mountains and forest, and it goes all the way up into the Arctic Circle. And then towards the northeast, it kind of comes down into like a Florida-like peninsula right across from Alaska. And that is in the heart of like the volcanic zone, really. In Kamchatka, the name of the peninsula, the city is Petropavlovsk, which is a naval port. It's backed by mountains, a stunning scenery, big bay. You can take little cruises of the bay and things like that. The town itself is very spread out. It's not always beautiful when you're in it, but it's beautiful to look at it if you look out over the bay and back toward the mountains. But that's the hub to go up into where there's grizzlies on lakes, and you see grizzlies feeding fish, and sometimes geologists that are getting too close. And going up to all these different kinds of volcanoes. I went to Tolbachik, which erupted in the 70s, with a geologist who was actually studying it during the eruption. There's actually several peaks. One of them is covered in snow, and I fell off the path into waist-deep snow one day. And the next day we were going up a red cone of dried lava where you can still see vapors that looked like Mars. I have never seen anything like it, and they were right next to each other. Fascinating scenery, unbelievable, unbelievably rewarding, but difficult. I mean, you have to go out on these 6-wheel drive former military vehicles out over hardened lava for hours and hours to get to these places, and you do need to take an organized tour. There's no way you can do this on your own, and they're not always cheap.
And who did you use for the organized tours that you've done in the area?
Lost World Tours is based in Petropavlovsk. They're really well organized. They speak English, and that puts them at a far greater advantage than most travel agents around Russia. NATA Tours and Komsomolsk, I mentioned earlier, also speak English and very organized. That's a rarity in a lot of these places. It's very hard to get information and plan these tours unless you have some kind of middle person that knows the Russian, and it can be difficult to get information. But Lost World Tours in Petropavlovsk, I took a couple trips with them and with a couple others, but I'd recommend Lost World the most. I thought they were the most organized.
Excellent. You mentioned something there, and you reminded me of one of the stories we were talking about previously. You mentioned geologist twice within 2 sentences. You had a story about how geology was cool at one point in Russian history. I wonder if you could tell that one.
You look at Yakutsk, a town I mentioned to a couple of times on permafrost, and this is an amazing story. It's a city of 250,000 people on permafrost. That's no way to get there by train or really by road. And the river itself, the ferry is irregular. It freezes. It's weird. Anyway, I met this very glamorous woman. Looked like she was wearing Prada. She's running an Italian restaurant. And she came in the 70s as a geologist. Last thing I expected her to say, she said, "Oh, yeah, in the 70s, of course, I wanted to be a geologist. It's the most romantic thing you could possibly be. A geologist, a Soviet geologist, and go out into the heart of Russian Far East and Siberia and freeze in the winter and learn about this country." Now, this, by the way, Yakutsk has a lot of diamonds, so maybe that enticed her too. But geology and science, it's like Novosibirsk, which is actually in Siberia in the middle of the country, has a whole wing of the city that still exists called Akademgorodok, which is Academy City or Academy Town. And it's all these science institutes that itself was itself a city. And that was the number one place for scientists to go in Soviet times. And you meet all these people on the train. I had like science professors there, and some of their students would be walking by the train and paying ultimate respect to this guy that's still in Akademgorodok, the academy town of Novosibirsk. So there's a real commitment to science that lingered from those Soviet times that you see. Yeah, not exactly what we would consider romantic in the States in most time. No offense to geologists, of course.
You have spent months in Russia, and including in this part of the country. Does it still surprise you?
The one thing I say to people that are thinking about this trip is that this is going to be a really hard trip. There's going to be times on this trip that you see amazing ugliness in grim neighborhoods and cities, and you feel far from home. And there'll be times that you see this stunning beauty, and there'll be times that you have these amazing connections with people. But there will be times that you go, why am I here? And Ian Fraser wrote about this in his book, Travels in Siberia Better Than I Could. And he called it Russia Love, Russia Love. And that it is basically, it's good and horrible at once. It's both great and horrible, Russia. You have to give up trying to reconcile the difference. It's both of those. And so when you say if there's a surprise, it's that when I'm there, there's moments that are harder than any travels I've ever had in my life. And there are times I'm going, is this worth it? It's expensive and difficult. I feel alone. And then you get back and you get this itch for the place with the taiga forest out the window, the guys with leather jackets and tattooed knuckles that end up crying over meeting you and having to leave and saying that they're going to remember you for all time. And that's not what you expected as a reaction to these people. And you want to get back in it. The surprise of Russia is just constant. It's just this amazing, it's a great country. It's a great culture. And it is misunderstood. And the surprise is there that no matter what, and if you look at these things, stats that says acceptance of foreigners and that Americans have a 22% favorability, things like that, and it's just not what happens. And you find that in travel everywhere. I mean, you find it in Russia. The surprise is just, at least for some of us, that rush of love that just grips you, and that despite those instant rewards you can have traveling in places, and you go to some Tuscan villa and there's this fantastic meal, and you look out and see the sun dip on these hills with a 14th century cathedral and the vineyards going to the horizon. Immediate reward. And Italy's not always an easy country. Russia's difficult. It's elusive to find that. But that rush of love is the surprise, because it grips you and it just doesn't go. I'm looking. I got a Soviet clock right here that hasn't worked since like 1978. Right here next to my computer. I'm looking at this thing. And whenever I see this thing, I think of Russia love. And it's this funny alarm clock that literally hasn't worked since Brezhnev died. It's Russia love. This is a surprise. It's within me. That's the surprise Russia has.
Well, in Brezhnev, as I recall, died from a cold, right? You have to watch those Russian colds.
I have a cold too, so I better wear a scarf and a hat.
When you mentioned your clock, are there any pictures that you took that bring back Russia to you, especially the Russian Far East?
I can think of a lot of photos right off as soon as you say that. I think of the volcanologist, a word I never used before, when I'm up in Mount Tobolchik in Kamchatka, and the most dramatic mustache. This is a mustache of the 19th century. This is a mustache that should be a museum. And there's Sasha with it, long kind of stringy hair, looks like the bass player of the Scorpions. No shirt on. Of course he doesn't. And there's just snow everywhere. This is the great Russian mustache of all time. This guy up there in total snow and has his shirt off. And I think about being in Yakutsk, I was talking about. A third of that city is Sakha. It's an ethnic minority that is descended, they believe, from Genghis Khan's, either with him or fighting against him, up from Mongolia. Mm-hmm. And I went to a festival, great festival for summer solstice called Issyk. And I went there, and there's these teepee-like sculptures, and there's throat singers, and there's like traditional tug of war, and all kinds of things that I couldn't begin to understand. I'm the only foreigner there. No Russians are there. People are giving me horse meat and hugging me, and people were very friendly. And I have this photo of these dancers about to go up on stage, and they're dressed like little kitty cats. And they turned and looked over their shoulder at me, and they all have these identical smiles. And it's just like, where am I? This is Russia. Really? There's a lot of things like that. It is about these kind of people connected with where they are. They love to be outside, as I said earlier. It isn't so much a mountain I saw, a forest I saw, or a town, a view necessarily, but this kind of connection with Russian people of all stripes, really, in their surroundings and loving it. They don't shy from the heat or the cold.
You have been there for months. I have never been there. One tip you would give me or somebody else who's listening that would make it a little easier, make the trip a little easier? If you only knew to do this.
Yeah, prepare to wait. You might think about, if you're taking the train, there are different agencies that you can work with, both out of Russia or in Russia, that you can book trips. Make sure that you stop. If you're going all the way for 7 days, do stop for a day or two. Maybe book your tickets in advance. It's very difficult to buy tickets. I know some Russian, and it's still a little difficult. Can be done. It used to be in Soviet times you couldn't do it. You had to have everything pre-planned. You can make up your trip as you go. Know that you might want to think about planning out your itinerary, unlike some travels. And I guess the third thing is learn the Cyrillic. Said it earlier. You can spend 2 days learning it. Get a little Russian phrase book. Spend some time learning some Russian. And even on the train, when you have 25 hours till you get to the next town, the people are going to love it that you're trying to learn Russian. This is good. This language is hard. And they will help you more than you want them to, perhaps. And that's a real good way to connect with people, too. Start by learning Cyrillic and prepare to wait in lines, no matter what. You'll be waiting every now and then.
Excellent. Before we get to my last 3 questions, what else would you want people to know before they go to the Russian Far East?
Well, I think it's a lot of the things that we talked about. It's a place that know that you are a unique traveler to go there. This is an adventure that rewards patience and curious eyes, and it almost doesn't matter so much where you stop, just that you do stop. So I've been to little towns like Tinda on the BAM line, which is the capital of that secondary train line, and had hilarious experiences with people that heard there was an American loose and drove around town to find me, stopped their car in the middle of the street and took me to a picnic in the mountains. And so do stop. Do stop. And you will have funny experiences. I met with beekeepers that took me on trips. This guy took me to a picnic, and funny things that will happen with people if you get out there and mingle with it anywhere.
Although I happen to know from that story that he didn't give you the beekeeper outfit. So
I did not have a beekeeper outfit, but I was not stung. The Russian bees are nice, very friendly. They love visitors.
Last three questions. One thing that makes you laugh and say only in the Russian Far East.
It's just that it will happen. You will get on this little bus or this little tram. This guy will kind of come on and be kind of like tottering on each leg and sit next to you, and you can smell the vodka coming out of his pores at 9 a.m. And he will look over to you, and he will like you, and then he will pull out maybe grapes. Like I can think of one case, and he has grapes, and he has a couple fingers missing for some reason I didn't ask, and he wants me to eat grapes with him and connect over these grapes. This man is extremely drunk on the tram at 9 a.m. You will meet drunk people, and Russians are wonderful drunks. They're wonderful. I never saw a fight. If you don't drink, you can, with effort, not drink. But they will want to drink with you. This guy just wanted to feed me grapes. And it just makes me laugh, this just fervent desire to connect with people sometimes, drunks or not. It's just like that. You're going to smell people with vodka coming out of their pores at 9 a.m, and they're going to be sweethearts. Most of them.
Finish this sentence. You really know you're in the Russian Far East when? What?
The ratio of taxidermy to things to do is everywhere you go, there's going to be stuffed animals, stuffed bears and lions, interlocked in some kind of waltz or attack. And they'll do playful things that amuse people making museums in the 1960s that are still there. Just I don't know. It's just funny little quirks of the past. You go down the street and you see graffiti of a 6-fingered hand giving you the finger with one of its 2 middle fingers, and it says "Pank Rules" next to it. P-A-N-K. Punk. It's a punk band. Punk fan, right? And the next to it is a grandmother with these kind of rose-colored dresses selling these sweet little cucumbers she made in her garden. It's just like this kind of dichotomy with strange anatomy of hands and things like that and graffiti next to the sweet grandmother that wants you to have her cucumbers for a small price. I don't know. It's all over the place. It's endless.
And if you had to summarize the Russian Far East in just 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
I'm overwhelmed. I mean, the 3 words is Moscow is far. It's their 3 words. You hear this. It's a mantra. Moscow is far. Moscow is far. And it lives by its own rules. You think about that family that went off the grid and lived in just because they saw it, an old bunker because they wanted to. You see people that they're creating their own little, I don't know, a little business of broken, battered gulags because some people are interested, or the guy that stops in the middle of the street that wants to take me to the mountains because he's thinking about doing these crazy ski trips out in places that have no lifts and no real means to get there. People feel there's a strange sense of can-do spirit that is almost at odds with what some of Russia is. A lot of places you go to, it's like a very can-do culture, but Russia, the first thing that people will say to you is, before you finish asking a question, if you're going to some office, they'll say, "Oh, no, it is not possible." That's out of their mouth before you finish the question. But individuals believe that. Moscow's far, and they do things. They play with the rules, and I don't mean in a seedy way. It's just enjoying what's around them, despite the limits of what's there. Moscow's far. Those are the 3 words they use, and I think the 3 words I'll use.
Excellent. Our guest has been Robert Reid. Robert, where can people read more about your travels?
In Novi Urgal on the BAM line. I think I left some notes there. If you find them, please let me know. I write on a blog. My own blog is Reid on Travel, R-E-I-D on Travel. I have a regular column with National Geographic Traveler's website, as well as a new one for Transitions Abroad and other little places here and there. So it's a lot of different things at once, but those are the 3 regular places they can see what I'm up to.
I don't think I've seen a video show from you recently. Are you still doing that regularly?
I did videos last year a little bit. I created The Right Pants, which is a non-award-winning and non-viewed series of videos of my own strange curiosities and desires about the life of a freelance travel writer, called The Right Pants. And each one, the ultimate travel question is, or at least was asked, am I wearing the right pants? And that is the ultimate travel question, isn't it?
I'm not sure.
Well, maybe next episode will answer for that for sure.
Excellent. Robert, thanks so much for coming back on The Amateur Traveler, and I mean back twice now on The Amateur Traveler to tell us the story about your love for the Russian Far East.
Oh, thank you. Russia is a place that is worth seeing at least once. Everyone should see it and prepare. Be open to what it gives you, and I hope it's a great trip.
Again, that was a longer episode, and I don't have much voice left. I taught an all-day class today at a local college on blogging, and that's why I sound like this now. We're going to skip to the news of the community, and with that, we'll end this episode of The Amateur Traveler. Remember, if you're looking for new credit cards, amateurtraveler.com/credit card. Please join us in the Facebook community where we are talking about where we would go with an amateur traveler trip, and I'm interested in your feedback if you're interested in that. To contact me, send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com, and you can also follow me on Twitter at Chris2X. And as always, thanks so much for listening.